as a woman in full labor, getting into a car is not an easy feat or a comfortable thing at all.
Evening, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the podcast, number 88. You've not come here for coronavirus chat, obviously, but simply to say a lot has happened in the weeks since we started putting out the first few episodes in this new series of Midnight Chats. No doubt with many of you, your usual routines, including your podcast listening habits, have been turned upside down by what's going on. We just hope that whenever and wherever you're listening to this, that you and those close to you are healthy and staying connected. Hopefully this podcast can give you a brief distraction from all that, and we'll keep them coming as best we can. But on to tonight's guest, Dan Snaith, a man who produces music under many guises, but is best known as Caribou. The chat you're about to hear was recorded in the first week of February this year, 2020. Dan was kind enough to invite me around to his house in North London. We wound our way through his hallway and down a set of very narrow stairs and into his basement studio where he works every day and makes his music. You may or may not pick this up on the recording. I can't remember if I left it in, but partway through our conversation, upstairs his young kids arrived back from school, and after we recorded this, they were leaping about in his kitchen doing a impromptu dance competition, which was a lot of fun. And they were very sweet and very welcoming, as was Dan himself. As many of you will know, Caribou has a new album out. It's available now and it's called Suddenly. I recommend you check that out. Going into it, I wasn't quite sure what to expect from the chat because as a producer, Dan has a reputation as a real technician, someone who takes very seriously his craft, and that's true, but the guy I met was very warm and conversational and deeply caring about his family and the major issues affecting the wider world, and just great company. It doesn't surprise me that he's really well liked within his community. So let's get into this. Stay safe, support your loved ones and your neighbours and your favourite podcasts. This is Caribou on episode 88 of Midnight Chats. And a quick reminder, as well as this podcast, we also make a monthly independent music magazine. It's called Loud and Quiet, and subscribing to that supports what we do and helps fund this podcast. All the information is at loudandquiet.com/subscribe. In terms of just to describe to listeners of exactly where we are, you've been so kind as to let us record this in your home studio. I can see an incredible amount of vinyl records. How many do you reckon you've got there?
Well, this is just they're also taking over the living room upstairs.
Okay, that's not all of it.
No, this isn't all of it.
Okay.
It's maybe 1,000 records or something, and then there's a couple more upstairs.
What have we got over here?
Then we've got some Fender Rhodes and an Oberheim OB8 and a Juno 106 synth. Modular synth over there. There's like a kind of black curtain over here behind which there's a drum kit for drum recording, and then use that as a vocal booth as well. But it's worth saying it's a mess, I would say, at the moment. There's stuff everywhere. It's hard to find a spot to put two chairs down here at the moment.
Can you tell me a little bit about this space and like how long you've been making music in this room? How far does it go back, and what did it used to be? Yeah,
so we moved into this house when just before our first child was born, which is about 8.5 years, closer to 9 years ago now. And this room it's a classic London terraced house, and this was like a coal hole, you couldn't stand up in it. You could barely stand up in it. Mud floor. But obviously when we were looking for a place, I was like, I'd never had a room that was like a studio in any sense. Like this room at least now is soundproofed and stuff like that. And so that was the thing we were looking for. And so we moved in here and converted this place with the help of some very able-bodied people who know how to build things. I'm not pretending that I did it myself. Let's put it that way. Finished this little room down here and put a bunch of gear in here, and then made Our Love and the new record Suddenly in this room. And I'm here every day.
I was going to say, you must have spent a lot of hours in here.
Oh, yeah.
Given the fact that it's in the basement of your house,
mm-hmm.
How does that mean that your work life, if you like, and your sort of home life interlink? I mean, it's literally you can sort of nip from having your breakfast to coming downstairs. Like, how does that actually work on a daily basis? What does your sort of routine look like?
Those two parts of my life are completely inseparable, right there together. And wake up and get the kids fed and take them to school, and then I'm back down here kind of until I used to work all hours every day all the time. Now I work much more kind of 9 to 5 and then come up, I just emerge from that. My kids are used to me like popping out of that door at the top of these little stairs from the basement and being in dad mode until they're in bed. And then maybe later when everybody else has gone to sleep in the house, I get back down here for another few hours.
Sneak back down here.
Yeah, exactly.
Midnight, like the equivalent of like a midnight feast, but with just samples or something.
Exactly. I mean, it is, that's one thing I love about it, is that it's here, available, ready whenever. I don't have to think, okay, I'm going home for the day from a studio, and it's always here. If I need to run down and make a note of something or record something or do, it's right there.
When you're working on a project, does it ever get too consuming? Because I suppose the opposite argument that people work in different ways, don't they? Some people would prefer to have a studio somewhere else, so that the moment they walk out the door, they kind of shut the door and they're like, well, I'm coming back to that tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you're sort of like, this is so accessible.
Yeah,
it can be like, oh, I'm just gonna nip down and just sort that. So yeah, is there any kind of friction in that sense?
Yeah, the thing that the risk would be that you could never turn off, which is a kind of contemporary, not just in my line of work, but in everybody's work these days, is you're expected to be available at all hours. But that used to be the situation when, before having kids, it was always there and I'd always disappear. Now I've developed the habit of delineating those chunks of my life more. For a couple weeks working on this album, Sam Floating Points was away on tour DJing, and he was like, Dan, like the studio's, he's got a proper, real amazing studio. You can see little videos of it online and stuff. It's incredible, and it's a dedicated space where you go and you open it up and you lock it up at the end of the day and you go home. And I recorded in there for a couple of weeks, and it was really productive, probably because it's like a vintage synthesizer museum in there. But also I did get a sense of that, which I've never had a separate space. I've always worked like from beside my bed, in my bedroom when I was a teenager and getting older, the same thing until we moved into this house. And I got a sense of that. Oh yeah, it can be good because there's less distraction and things like that as well. So you go there for a concentrated period of time, but there's nothing else to do there. You're just working all the time. But in the end, I mean, it's evident in the music that I make, particularly on this album. My personal life ends up in the music that I make, so it makes sense for them to be alongside one another.
And even though I can see an awful lot of music here today, all of these vinyl records that we've already mentioned, you did have a bit of a clear out this week. You took some music and you took some equipment down to your local Oxfam shop.
Yep.
Beyond the obvious reasons of that being able to go to a good cause and make some money for charity. Yeah, what do you like about doing that? Because it always seems to get a bit of traction when it's like, oh, Caribou's left some sort of gems in the local charity shop. So what was it that you like about doing that?
Yeah, I did it once before. I just let's say like these record shelves look full, but actually if I kind of grab them and I pull, there's like a good couple inches on either of these. Yeah. And before there's even like 4 or 5 inches spare down there. Before that clear out, these was like wedged in here till it was like a solid wall. You couldn't get a finger in anywhere.
Okay.
So the ones upstairs, there's actually more space. It doesn't look like I've had a clear out, does it?
It's still looking pretty jammed. I've got to ask as well, how do you arrange your vinyl? Is it via alphabetical? Is it genre? Is it any system?
It's like dance music, club music up there, hip hop down here, these three. This is more experimental music. So upstairs is like jazz and rock, and it's genre basically.
Yeah. How often do you visit a vinyl record? Do you listen to it every day? You like a couple of times a week? Do you never? Like, I mean, I find myself going through kind of periods where I'll listen to it lots, and then maybe a couple of weeks will go by, and then I won't listen at all, and then I'll go back again. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, the honest answer at the moment, and part of the reason for the clear out, was that barely ever. Yeah. Music's available to us all digitally, universally all the time. And a lot of these records that I really love, I've ripped onto a digital file, and that's the way I'm going to sample them or manipulate them, is inside a computer eventually. I've got down to the point where I'm just keeping the things that mean something sentimental to me, which is still a lot. once before I'd taken a pile of them to the same Oxfam without intending it to be a thing, just like taking them in there, and they posted on social media like, "Hey, Dan's just being in here," and they were like, "We were swamped," and so I was like, "Okay, well, actually, that seems to be a big part of what I like about, I've spent my whole life learning about music, accumulating music that I like, and one thing that I can do that seems nice and generous and people appreciate it is like some kind of sharing it." This obviously is like raising money for charity is the other thing, but realizing that people have that connection with like, oh, and I get that. I totally remember as a kid and even now, oh, what's that person been listening to? That if somebody whose music I'm interested in. So this time I was like, okay, I'll do a proper clear out, get a few 100 records together and take it down there all at once. And yeah, apparently it was very busy yesterday.
It's good. But there are a few bits of kit as well, because is there something, presumably you kind of like quite like the idea that somebody picks a bit of kit, plays around with it, maybe ends up on somebody else's album one day, whoever they might be.
There were a few bits of equipment. I've done that before. I've done it just on eBay and things, just sold things. And I sold a little sampler that we used to use on stage, and I had forgotten to like delete the samples off it. And the person who bought it was just like, "Hey, I just arrived. And by the way, are you Caribou? Because when I hit this button, like a part of your record appears, as things that we'd be triggering during the show." And I was like, oh yeah, I probably should have. But it's nice to feel that kind of sense of lineage and, connection. I imagine people might like that. I like that idea. For example, the last album, Our Love, was mixed on Nigel Godrich's mixing desk, and like that was amazing to think like it was from, I think it's called Ocean Way Studios in Los Angeles he got it from, and to have that sense of like, whoa, this has been so much amazing music's come through here, and he's mixed so many amazing things on there. In this room you can see this is like not a kind of, doesn't have that thing of big grand studio equipment and stuff, but I like that idea.
Yeah. It's kind of appropriate that we're here recording this podcast in your studio that's at home, because home is a real like central theme to Suddenly, which is the new Caribou album. Home and family and life and love and loss and all those things. So just tell me a little bit about how those elements, those things, those everyday things via osmosis make their way into your music.
Over the years I've become comfortable having more and more of that personal stuff end up in my music. Requires some kind of degree of confidence to know that people are going to hear those personal things about my life and to put them in the music. And this, in the past 5 years while I was making this record, unlike previous times in my life, there were just so many of these big, often quite difficult moments in my family. Our love was when we had our first daughter, and the kind of world seems new and everything's shiny and rose tinted and everything. It's kind of this utopian feeling. And the last years while I was making this, there's been loads of happiness. I don't want to make it sound like it was all misery and difficulty, because it wasn't at all. But the big things that shaped like the kind of brought our family together, unfortunately, a lot of them were difficult things. Like in my wife's family, there was a death of somebody with a heart attack, not much older than me, and then that catalyzed a divorce. And so her family was, and my wife and I have been together for 20 years. You saw our niece is living with us in this house. So I'm there as close as my family. There's no distinction really. And that just like rocked the kind of foundations of all of us. And particularly myself and my wife ended up in the situation of having to support people that were even closer to these things than we were. And I think the music helps. Well, some of the songs are like a letter, a tribute directly to the. There's the song "New Jade" is like a tribute to my wife's sister who escaped this toxic marriage that she'd been in for decades and was so strong and brave and resilient in doing that. And I wanted to pay tribute to her and capture that. And so. Yeah, it would have been very, very strange had these things which like shaped my life not been on this record. It'd be like looking back and thinking it doesn't represent what was happening in my life at that time.
And some of the songs on the album are not just kind of like first person perspective, your thoughts on those situations, but almost kind of imagine through the eyes of those people. Is that right?
Yep, that's true. Yeah,
I suppose that comes from your natural empathy around the situations with your family members.
that role of being supportive and comforting or empathizing, or and then also processing it myself, all of those things are kind of happening together, and that's what the music allows me. And on all these difficult things in the record, I think it still sounds quite, there's kind of melancholy elements in it, but it still sounds quite affirming and positive. It was about finding something to give comfort, to be some positive in some sense out of it. And the music does that for me as well. It's like, it's a way of processing difficult things and making something constructive or even sometimes joyous out of it, making those difficult things work in some way.
Do you think music kind of plays almost like a sort of meditative role when something big happens in your life, something you weren't expecting, whether that's the loss of somebody or whatever it might be, big change? Some people kind of find solace in like doing some exercise, like maybe going for a walk, like getting some fresh air, whatever it might be. If you come to understand music, is it playing in almost a sort of like a therapeutic, like meditative,
for sure,
part of you processing your own thoughts on things?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. And I mean, another way, just occurred to me, like people will rely on other people's music to process things, when they're going through a difficult time. People have told me that about other music that I've made, or, I know other musicians or just friends who've relied on a record to help them with that. But my impulse in that kind of a situation is to make the music that feels like it'll do that to me.
I can hear some footsteps upstairs as your kids arrive back from school.
Yeah, it's that time. It's 3:45. The tiny feet are running over the floors above us.
How will they spend the next few hours?
So they're very different in age. There's an 8-year-old and there's a 3-year-old. The 8-year-old now just she's a real writer. She'll just spend her time writing and creating all these projects herself. She's really invested in environmental action as well, which is a thing for kids these days, right? Unfortunately, because we've left them in the scenario where that's relevant. So yeah, she's really focused in that way, which is remarkable to see. The 3-year-old is just like a ball of fun and trouble and energy. So yeah, they have very different modes that their after school takes. Yeah, but they're both sociable kids, so that often it's that sounded just like the two of them, but often it's like 10 kids come plowing into the house after school.
Half of the class is coming back
which is
party at yours.
It's so nice. I mean, it's really, really nice to have that kind of a house where it's like the doors are open all the time, people are coming and going. This neighborhood we live in is kind of like a bit of a Sesame Street. That maybe is not a British appropriate reference, but
it's definitely, we get that.
I can't walk out of the house without like saying hello to 5 different people, which is really nice.
Before we talk a little bit more about Suddenly, I suppose we should wind back a little bit. We talked about Our Love and that period. If we were to look back to sort of 2014, 2015 and like the music that you'd made, that record took you all over the world, the biggest stages you ever played, the biggest song that you've ever released. Like, coming off the back of that, what were your initial thoughts going into the process of starting to write new material? Did any extra thoughts, any extra baggage, any extra pressure come with any of that?
It was all really affirming. I kind of made Our Love Swim had seemed like a big step up for me. And I made Our Love as a kind of thank you and to share directly with the people who my music had kind of connected to. And it kind of lived up to that potential. It Can't Do Without You. When I was making it, I was already picturing playing it at Glastonbury or playing it wherever. And it had exactly that kind of life, which is so wonderful. I mean, man, I'm so fortunate to get to play the shows that we get to play and travel around and share this music, have my music mean something to people. That's such a fortunate thing that I don't lose sight of or take for granted. So that's what that album was all about. But then I also realized, like, okay, I always to some degree think of myself as a musical weirdo or outsider. I'm never going to make bona fide pop music, really popular pop music. I was like, I can't just keep chasing that thing. I can't try and make another Can't Do Without You or like take it up to another level every single time. That's not a sustainable, sensible thing to do. And that will be frustrating and drive me crazy. So instead it was like, well, people have been very generous in the past with following my weird trajectory through different genres, different styles, music that's quite unusual or idiosyncratic, eccentric at times. So I don't need to be afraid of that. I think that's kind of the thinking that you can get into when things have gone well. You can think, okay, I'd better not take any risks because that's not what people want from me. That'll ruin everything. But I was like, no, I'm not sure that's true. And particularly, like, I feel like we live in a time when there's so much music everywhere that the music that actually connects with people and has a life is the music that stands out or is different or presents like things from a slightly different angle or lens. So it was kind of like, I feel like I don't need to worry about those things. And I didn't really worry about it. Instead, it kind of gave me a kind of impetus to highlight those idiosyncrasies and eccentricities in the music, which I think you hear in the kind of way that the songs will take drastic left turns. There'll be a genre shift halfway through a song, or the bottom feel like the floor dropped out from underneath you, and you'll be in a different world all of a sudden. And that felt exciting and different to me. That's not been something that's really been on my previous records. And just from a kind of producer's self, in my very particular perspective, I always want to feel like I'm doing something different. I don't want to feel like I'm treading over the same territory.
The space we're sat in now, I mean, it's not a big space. There's a lot of stuff in here.
No.
So, like, what I'm imagining is that you're working on music is a fairly kind of solitary experience.
Oh,
so
yeah.
who are the people, who are your sounding boards through the process of creating suddenly? Because like you say, you have tried a few different things. So presumably at various stages, you wanted to say to people, I've done something a bit different here. What do you think of this? This is not my, I've not done this before. Or you wanted just to seek those little bits of feedback or reassurance or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's my wife and Kieran, Four Tet. And, I make so much music. I made 900 and something draft ideas for this album, which is just a crazy, stupid. I mean, it's almost like somebody, I should be referred to a, psychotherapist. So when you hear that number, but I make that music because I enjoy making it, and I make it without any pressure or critical thinking about, is this good? Is this bad? Does this fit on the record? Does it not? I just make it tinkering around the same way that I've always done since I was a teenager. It's just a part of my life that I enjoy, like I can't imagine being without. In that respect, it doesn't matter to me that 99%, like the vast majority of this stuff will never see the light of day. But then there are definitely some that the vast majority that I make are like, okay, that doesn't add anything to anything. It's just like, was fun to do, but nobody ever needs to hear that. Fine. Then there's a bunch that I'm like, feel pretty confident about. And then there's also ones that I, like you say, they are something different. They're something unusual. They are more of a risk or more of something. And having my wife and Kieran hear those, and then they're both brutally honest with me. They'll be, that's important. That's really important for me because I'm so close to it. I need that perspective. And there are times when I'm super excited about something, and they'll just be like, "Nope, sorry, this isn't as good as."
Particularly brutal when it comes from your wife, then, isn't it?
Oh yeah, oh totally. She can be exactly as she should be. It means she cares about what I'm doing.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
not letting things just slide. But it can be difficult to hear for sure.
What about, we've already mentioned your two daughters. Do they take an interest in what you do? Do they come down to the studio, listen to the music as you're making it? Have they kind of, particularly your older daughter perhaps, has she been kind of bitten by like the music bug?
So the 3-year-old comes and sits in that chair that you're in right now and asks me to swivel her around. It's like a spinning chair.
It would be quite fun.
That's her thing. The 8-year-old does want to hear now and does kind of understand the whole idea, like gets that I'm going to release an album, and then I'm going to go on tour, and I'm going to play at festivals, and she's probably going to come and see some shows, and et cetera, et cetera. And that, that it came out of me being really into music as a kid and playing the piano lots, and this gradually, she kind of gets the whole picture to some degree. Well, to a surprisingly complete degree probably, because she's so commonplace in her life. There was a great moment. I can't remember the exact wording, but there was a time when she was like describing, people end up with like a normal job, like musician or et cetera, et cetera. We were like, hang on a minute, like A musician isn't really a normal. I mean, it's fortunately there's lots of people who do it, but it's not like what people think of as a normal job. But she's so inside that world where obviously I have lots of friends that are musicians as well. Yeah, she really wanted to hear this album and gave it a good listen and thought. And she said to me very seriously, like, Dad, I think Home is going to be the most popular thing you've ever done. Which is, I was like, where did that come from? Yeah, I mean, great.
Stamp of approval.
Yeah, and she plays piano. She comes down here and plays these drums sometimes. One thing I'm cautious about, and it's not where I come from at all, the like kind of having music force, like I love music, so you've got to love music. Yeah. I don't, it's everywhere. So if they want it, it's available to them. Yeah. But I never had that, and I don't want that to be the way they get into it.
It's like the sort of pushy dad soccer coach thing, isn't it? Of just being like, you will do this thing. Like, you kind of, I'm good to maybe resist that.
Totally.
Let them do whatever they're going to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, we talked a bit about some of the loss, unfortunately, that went into the making of this album. But obviously, your second daughter was born during the making of this record as well. So, and from what I've read, that was quite an eventful experience.
Yeah. So that was another sudden development in a different kind of way. She was born on the Caledonian Road. I mean, literally onto the road. We don't have a car, so we were headed towards hospital in Euston, UCH. And my wife was in labor, and it was like we'd made a plan that to have a doula, like this woman who's a midwife at a hospital, but then she was going to come and assist us, but also drive us to the hospital. That was a key part of the plan. Right. And because like otherwise you're in a taxi, and that's even crazier. So, and then I was like texting her during the day being like, I think, it's like things are picking up here, she was at work at a hospital, a different hospital.
Right.
When do you think you can get here? And by the time she did get here after work, because it can take a long time, by the time she got here, she took one look at my wife and like just her face like fell, and she was like, we've got to get in the car right now. That was a crazy scene. For one thing, just as a woman in full labor, getting into a car is not an easy feat or a comfortable thing at all. Then, we're like getting stuck in traffic. It's London. You can get stuck in a spot because some lorry's pulling out or whatever. And by the time we were close. We almost made it, for the record. But then at some point on the Caledonian Road, my wife was just like, this is happening right now. Yeah. Pull over the car. And the woman, the midwife, ran around, opened the door. The baby was born. Our daughter was born like that second. There was no waiting around. And then 30 seconds later, we were all laughing and crying, sitting there. There were people, just people all around, and nobody really noticed this was happening. It was a weird one of those things where you're in an urban environment, but people are so focused on their own thing. Yeah, it was crazy, really crazy moment.
I suppose one of the nice things about that, as no doubt stressful as it was at points, most people wouldn't really get the opportunity to go back to the place where they were born, yet your daughter's going to have a life where she can go back to the exact spot where she was born. It's
pretty cool, actually. We do go past there on the bus or in a taxi or whatever and say, hey, Liv, that's where you were born, Yeah, that is an interesting... And it's the same for us, that spot will never be the same as well. Again, we lived on Caledonian Road actually for several years, so it seems like an appropriate place for it. I mean, aside from a hospital, which would have been another appropriate place for it to happen.
Presumably the title suddenly is reference to these things that have come along in life without any warning.
That is what it refers to, but I have a weird kind of backwards way of arriving at it and the meaning behind it. Because it was this daughter that was born in a car or on the road that had just added this word to her vocabulary. She was about to turn 3, and everything was suddenly and actually. Those were 2 words at the time. Actually this, suddenly that. And I was desperate to find a title. I hate finding album titles, song titles. And it was like past the deadline of when the record's done, everything's done, and I don't have a very good picture or perspective necessarily on exactly what it was all about, because it's such a blur trying to get it all finished and stuff. And my wife spotted her saying this word over and over again, said, what about that, suddenly? And I thought of it, and I think my wife thought of it in reference to the kind of sudden musical changes in the music, because there's quite a lot of those, there's those moments. And I thought, oh yeah, maybe that's makes sense. And then I would play the album to friends of mine, and they would use the word suddenly to describe the music. And I was like, okay, maybe it makes sense. And then it was when I was press person that was writing up the press for release was like, tell me something about like the circumstance of making this album, what your life has been like, all that stuff. And I started writing it all out and realized like this is how I was really blind to that fact that the shape of my life has been changed by these sudden things. And that's what all these songs are about. They're all about these things. So it's funny how appropriate it is, given that I, it was come up with by a toddler. Or it's weird the way it seems so inevitable now. Like it couldn't have been called anything else, and yet I didn't have the forethought or the perspective to be able to see that myself at the time.
Continuing on the sort of theme of family, there's a sample of your mother on the album, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about that? Where did that come from?
So that came from my parents are English, and they moved over to Canada. My dad's an academic, so he got a job at the university over there. And before I was born, and my mom's parents were still here, so she would make these tapes, cassette tapes. This was late 70s, early 80s, that she would record of us doing stuff, I don't know, her reading to us, my older sisters reading something they'd written at school, or playing something that they learned on the piano, or et cetera, that kind of stuff. Or even just her talking, describing what we'd been doing as a family, like a kind of letter, but an audio letter. And there's a whole bunch of these tapes that span probably a decade, but then probably things got too busy, or, I don't know, for whatever reason, we weren't little kids anymore, so it didn't make sense to do these, that she would send back to her parents. And I kind of knew they existed, but then we got them back when my grandparents passed away, right. Inevitably. And I was like, well, nobody else has a tape recorder, tape deck. I can record, we should have these, this is like a
great piece of family history.
Yeah.
What a lovely thing to be able to keep.
Absolutely. And it's, there was, unlike my daughter's life where every moment is documented and recorded in some way, there's not that much of my childhood recorded in sound or video. I digitized all this, sent it around, but also just like listened to it, because it was fascinating to hear the kind of reality of what life sounded like then versus our kind of remembrances of our childhood. And then it occurred to me, this album, this is what the themes about family, and we're so enmeshed in the music that I thought there should be some part of this on here. And I found this part of my mom singing. She's singing to my sister, this is before I was born, when my sister was like a 2-year-old. And I just found a spot to place it on the album.
It just seems so apt, given all the stuff that we've talked about, that's included on there. You mentioned it earlier on about your daughter's passion for sustainability, for environmental issues, and the fact that, like you say, we're the younger generations, people younger than yourself and myself, they're having to be incredibly active in that respect because, of our generation's lack of action. Do you think a lot about the issue of sustainability, and how does that kind of work in parallel to just your job and your lifestyle and things like that?
Yeah, so it is something that I think about a lot, and actually, and it's something that comes up in discussions with musician friends of mine all the time.
Right.
There's a lot of travel and flying around, and festivals have a huge footprint, and etc. And I feel like there really is a great desire amongst musicians and in the music industry to be sustainable, be better, but people are kind of like paralyzed by not knowing what to do. All of us are none of us are outside of this problem, so it's very hard to feel like you can make a statement when you're compromised yourself. And that's definitely a way that I feel like, how can I say we should do this when people are like, yeah, get on another plane to another festival. But this time it's critical to the degree where we have to put that aside and act anyway. So there are a number of things that I've done for this record and the tour. We've been offsetting our travels for a decade now, the tour. But this time we got Julie's Bicycle is a really good nonprofit that does kind of audits and stuff for businesses, I think in general, but maybe particularly creative industries and stuff. And they discussed with us the best things we can do regarding the tour, aside from, offsetting. Obviously, we're going to offset the whole tour and everything, but minimizing the footprint of various things. And then also to do with the production of the record, manufacturing the physical copies in such a way that has the least impact. The CD comes in entirely cardboard packaging, using recycled paper and FSC certified materials, which is something that the labels that I'm working with already do, offsetting the entire footprint of the production of the music and also of the streaming. There's a good book that's just actually been released that I haven't had an advanced copy of, about the footprint of streaming and how it's significant. It's not like, oh, now people listen to it in the ether and that doesn't create any problem. So it's something to be aware of, and I'm going to continue as the albums listened to continue offsetting that. It's something I think about all the time. I think and I hope we will see, but it's still super problematic. Like I say, I don't feel like I have a good answer or a complete answer in any way. Everywhere I turn, I'm talking to musicians that are thinking about this and trying to do things. That is different from 5 years ago.
Tell me a little bit about how you feel like that's changed the last few years.
There's a change in that for sure. That's definitely the sense I get. I would say the thing that really changed it for me and gave me the sense of that I needed to make that decision personally and stop worrying about being a hypocrite when we're all to some degrees hypocrites. But I realized that the kind of touring footprint is larger than, we're currently, that's what we do. We calculate every aspect of it so that we can offset it. So I'm acutely aware of exactly the consequences of, this is an interesting thing. I can say this actually. With Julie's Bicycle, we did an audit of our UK tour, and I was like, it's the UK, trains everywhere. We can just travel on trains. The lighting and stuff will have to go in a truck, but we can go on a train and then stay in hotels, and instead of going in a tour bus. And we worked out the numbers for it, and actually the cost of even we share hotel rooms, two of us to hotel rooms, so as to kind of minimize our impact. But even so, with like 4 hotel rooms or whatever it would be a night, their footprint, think about what you do in a hotel room. You can turn the heat up and like all the laundry gets washed every day and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Telly goes on, et cetera.
Yeah. You're not thinking in the same way that you are at home, or it's somebody else's problem kind of thing. And we realized, surprisingly, because on a tour bus, we don't get hotel rooms. We just stay in the tour bus and we use the shower in the venue. And the footprint of those 2 modes of doing the UK tour was virtually identical, which was totally a surprise to me. This is a big thing for me, is that we must be like evidence-led, because I don't want it to appear like I'm doing this to be worthier or holier than thou. This is a situation where the important thing is that we are minimizing some physical thing, which is the amount of greenhouse gases emitted, and we need to be evidence-led in doing that. One of the things that really turned up the metaphorical temperature, to use an unfortunately relevant metaphor, is a book called The Uninhabitable Earth by...
I've read it.
David Wallace Wells, which is just devastating. It's a crushing book to read. And for those listening who haven't read it, it's it's very sober, and he wasn't even kind of an evangelical environmental activist. He came to this quite recently. And he just goes through and assembles all the kind of, very non-contentious mainstream evidence about if the global temperature raises 2 degrees in the next 40 years, these are the things that will happen.
Yeah.
And then, it doesn't stop there. In another 40 years, it'll gone up another degree or 2. And he goes through all the scenarios, and it's just mind-boggling. It's so devastating, agricultural decline, massive sea level, and it also dispels the myth that this is a problem that's happening somewhere else. I think that's the big thing too, is that people are like, this is happening to somebody I don't know on the other side of the world. Whereas you read this book and you realize that is not the case at all.
You can't not read it and not feel compelled to take personal action, I think. The first 35 pages, the introduction as it were, also does a quite, I think, interesting job of explaining how the climate crisis hasn't been addressed to the degree that it needs to be so far, because of the fact that it feels so enormous that people can't basically get their head around it. Those conversations that you've had with people behind the scenes, does it feel like now there's like a kind of swell of conversation happening, and do you think people will be encouraged to get together and work a path through it? You kind of you feel quite positive about that?
There's times that I feel positive and there's times I feel defeated and by the whole thing. Yeah, I think that we'll see, you know, I have friends in the music industry who are working on doing really big projects and things that will hopefully come to fruition in the next few years, like raising huge amounts of money, because we need, like, it's all very well to stop DJ X, Y, and Z taking private jets. That contributes, there's no question, but we need like big systemic changes in our society. We, you know, inevitably, like, we definitely do need to see those things happen. And so it's good to see people who have a lot, you know, the music industry, when united, can like mobilize in a really big way. And I'm starting to see it's all very well us offsetting our tours and whatever. Sure. But there needs to be people with bigger, bolder ideas. And I'm starting to see those things happen. And hopefully that's something that we can, like, you know, sign on to and join up with and contribute to in some way. But in the last 2 years, even, there's been a real change in mentality about the scale of the problem and about how crucial it is that we address it now.
I'm interested to know, we talked a bit about Suddenly, the record, we talked about your kind of passions and your interests and your family and everything else. We touched upon when we were talking about you taking the kit down to Oxfam and the records down to Oxfam, that almost sort of passing of your experience, your passing of your knowledge. You know, you've been making music for a long time. You're clearly still kind of learning yourself every day with your art, your technique and everything else. But what about passing on your skills? Like, do you feel a sort of duty to other producers you meet, young producers, other people that are in the kind of industry, so to speak, that you just sort of want to be like, hey, I've spent a long time learning about all this stuff. Like, I can help you by giving you some knowledge or some, well, quite literally give you some equipment in some cases.
Yeah.
So yeah, how important is that to you?
Very important, and it's really relevant right now, actually. I mean, it's kind of reflective of the fact that Kieran was that person for me. He helped me get my music signed in the first place, and he's always been that kind of sounding board and feedback. And then I look around in his life, and he does that for so many people, that people in our little world of electronic music aren't aware of the number of people that are asking Kieran, hey, would you mind listening to this and tell me what you think, and et cetera, et cetera. People starting out, people very well established. And I've realized, like, I've been a beneficiary of that. And not just from Kieran, but I've had lots of good kind of mentoring in the music world about anything, music, but also like the practical things of how to do this and that. And so there are like a bunch of people that I do that same thing for. And I feel very, you know, happy to be able to be, that they ask me and are interested in my opinion. But on another level, this is something that is kind of in the works or bubbling along, and hopefully will be manifested sometime soon. But it's very somewhat hypothetical at this point. But I just DJ'd at Cosmic Slop, which is this club that's run out of a charity called MAP in Leeds. Okay. And it's this friend of mine, Cosmic Tom Smith, runs this incredible charity that is set up to teach creative skills to children, kids, teenagers who are excluded from mainstream education. And he's been running this for 10 years, incredibly. And he's also like an incredible hi-fi sound system nut. So he's built like this unbelievable club with the greatest possible sound you can imagine for like 150, 200 people, and never announces who's playing. Sometimes it's just him and the other person who runs it. Or sometimes it's, you know, me or Sam, Floating Points, Kieran, whoever, various people have done it. And that funds the whole model for this program, which is amazing. He's managed to buy this building. That was a bigger fundraising drive, but he's bought this huge building that's situated in. And that is so inspiring to me. And so I'm kind of interested to see if there are ways that I can be more involved in things like that, or, you know, I guess I've come to realize that just fundraising in general, I don't know, that I've done a couple gigs for Choose Love, help refugees and stuff like that. This is a platform that I feel very fortunate to have, And I hope this doesn't come across as like preachy, fucking holier than thou. But it's just, I've got to the place I always wanted to get to. And now it's time to like turn around and see who I can use this platform to help.
Anyway, good night.